Hi, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started here in about 30 seconds or a minute, but we're just going to give a little bit of time for people to join us and find our feed. All right. Looks like we've got a couple people watching, so we will go ahead and get started. I'm very happy to welcome today Sandy Stoneman and Chrissy Blankenship from Wythe County. And they are going to talk about pressure canning. So this is kind of the follow-up to last week's session on water bath canning. We're going to talk about pressure canning today. So a very important topic. And then next week, to round out our home food preservation series, we're going to talk about freezing. So join us next week back here at 2 o'clock. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sandy and Chrissy.
Hey, thanks. All right, well, I'm going to share my screen. I'm Sandy Stoneman, and then like Devin said, I have Chrissy Blankenship here. She's my right-hand woman, and we usually tag team and teach food preservation classes. And today we're going to share with you pressure canning, just a little presentation that I put together to try to explain pressure canning the best you can through virtual learning. Normally we do these classes and we love to do them hands-on so that people actually learn as they're doing. So that's not really a possibility at this point in time in our world, in our COVID-19 world. So we're doing everything virtually. So I'm going to go through this presentation and then would love to have questions and feedback at the end. So be sure if you have a question, jot it down and make sure that we can get those to Devin and we'll make sure we get them answered for you at the end. So just as far as how do you even start with home canning? And I know last week, some of you may have watched the water bath canning presentation, and what we're talking about today for the most part is just pressure canning. But I did want to cover just some of the basics, just in case some of you may have missed last week's presentation on water bath canning. It's really important though, for the very first step in home canning is to make sure you start with the best quality of food that you can. So in order to get a good home canned product, you need to start with the freshest food that you can. So, you know, the closer to being picked and the right, you know, perfect peak of ripeness is really important. Once you know what you're going to can and the food item that you're going to can, you need to make sure that you have a tested recipe. And you'll probably hear that like 3 or 4 times in the next few minutes. But you really want to make sure that you're following a valid tested recipe for canning. When you're canning, what you're doing is you're putting food into like a canning jar, or sometimes we call them a mason jar, and then you're putting a lid on top of that jar after you've packed it with food, and then a ring on top of that lid, and then you heat that jar to a temperature that will destroy the microorganisms that could be in the food there or in the jar. And those microorganisms are the ones that can cause food spoilage or even foodborne illness. So it's really important. That's why we want to follow that tested recipe to make sure that we're accomplishing that. The heating of the jar also will inactivate certain enzymes that can cause your food to change color, flavor, and even texture. So it really does, it preserves it in all ways and makes it safe. During the process, the air is actually driven from the jar while it's heating. And then the jar, as it cools, will actually, the lid on the jar will create a vacuum seal. And that vacuum seal is what holds that lid on the jar. It's not, actually not, a lot of people think, oh, I need to keep the ring on the jar. The lid is actually, once that vacuum seal is in place, that lid, it stays on the jar without the ring. That vacuum seal also helps because it's a sealed vacuum seal. There's no way any other contamination can get into the food. So it keeps that food preserved. And it also keeps air from getting into the food and drying it out. So the food will stay nice and moist. So there's two types of canning methods, and I kind of already mentioned that, that we've got boiling water canning method, and then we have a pressure canning method. Well, the canning method that you're supposed to use depends on what kind of food that you're trying to preserve. So food, you may not realize this, is divided into two categories, and that's what helps us decide what kind of canning method to use. So foods are either what we call acid foods or they're low acid foods. So an acid food is going to be, I know this might be getting into some of that chemistry that we had way back in high school, but acidity is actually measured on the pH scale, and the scale runs from 0 to 14. So, obviously something that has a low number is going to be an acid food. Something that has a higher pH is going to be more of considered alkaline or basic. But, and then something that falls right in the middle would be neutral, and that'd be right around 7. But an acid food officially is a food that has a pH or acidity value of 4.6 or lower. And that's generally all fruits, and if you think about fruits, they're tart. So that's the acidity of that food item. Also, tomatoes and figs can be acidic, but they tend to be right on the border of that 4.6 pH. So we now make sure that we add an acid to those to acidify those tomatoes or figs before we can them, to make sure that they're truly acid foods. Sauerkraut is an acid food, and then also any kind of food item where we add a lot of acid. So if you think about pickles, and you're putting the cucumbers in the jar and you're adding vinegar, and vinegar is very acidic. So we're acidifying those foods, and therefore they become acid foods. Now, low acid foods are any food item that has a pH greater than 4.6. And that's really all vegetables. So, potatoes, beans, carrots, any kind of vegetable is, for the most part, considered a low acid food. It's also meats, poultry, seafood, any kind of soup that's maybe, or any kind of mixture of a food that's maybe both high acid and low acid, something like maybe a tomato-based product, but then you add in meat or vegetables to that. So there's two approved canning methods that we've talked about, the boiling water and the pressure canning. So we've already mentioned that. So boiling water method is basically truly just using boiling water to can foods. And then there's pressure canning, where you're actually building pressure so that the temperature builds to at least 240 degrees. So boiling water canning is only approved for foods that are acid foods. And then pressure canning has to be used for any low acid foods. So you would never want to try to, water bath can green beans or potatoes, because those are low acid foods. And the only way that you can safely can those is to use a pressure canner. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is. So the main reason that low acid foods have to be pressure canned is due to one microorganism, and that is Clostridium botulinum. You've probably heard of botulism. Well, Clostridium botulinum is the bacteria that actually causes botulism. As the Clostridium botulinum bacteria grows, it will produce, one of the byproducts is the botulism toxin. And that is the main reason why we have to pressure can our low acid foods. The problem with Clostridium botulinum is that it's a bacteria that's a spore former. In other words, it's a bacteria that can kind of put on a protective coating and survive even high heats, all of our, like even boiling water temperatures, that do not kill it. It can survive. The only way we can kill the botulism bacteria is to bring it to a temperature of 240 degrees. And keep it at that temperature for a certain amount of time. And then we can ensure that that botulism spore has been killed. So normal boiling water bath type temperatures, like 212 degrees does not kill botulism. So let's talk a little bit more about botulism. What makes it so special? Well, botulism is kind of a unique little microorganism in that it does not like oxygen. So it only likes environments, or will only grow and produce that toxin in low oxygen environments. Well, once we create a vacuum in that jar of food, you've now got a low oxygen environment. And if we leave that vacuum sealed food item that wasn't properly canned out in a temperature range between 40 and 140 degrees, then that botulism can start growing in that food and producing the toxin that really can cause a lot of damage. The other thing about botulism is that you can't tell that it's growing in the food. You can have a perfectly good looking jar of food that you've canned, and if you canned it improperly, then that food can look fine, but that botulism toxin can be in there. Botulism is a bad thing. It usually, after you consume the food, you're going to have symptoms within about 12 to 72 hours. And yes, you may have some, it's just like most foodborne illnesses, you're probably going to have some digestive issues, but it attacks your nervous system and you can end up with blurred or double vision. A lot of people, it shuts your lungs down. You end up not being able to swallow or breathe. And if you don't get the antitoxin quick enough, then you actually can die from botulism. So that's not something we want to mess around with. So how can we prevent botulism? Well, the good news is that botulism doesn't like acid. So all of our foods that are high in acid, like our fruits, we don't have to worry about botulism because it just can't grow in anything that is in an acidic environment. Also, if we will make sure that for our low acid foods that we use the proper pressure canning method, that'll raise the temperature up to at least 240 degrees for the right amount of time and kill the botulism spores. So that's why specifically pressure canners are the only way to go for low acid foods. I love this quote, and I threw this in here because I really, I'm a food safety nerd anyway, but Dr. Ben Chapman is a food scientist and a food safety specialist at North Carolina State University, and this is his quote. So he says, as far as canning goes, this is one area where you don't want to be Rachel Ray. You don't want to add flair to your recipes and techniques backed by good science and rigorous testing. So basically he's saying, don't change the recipe. When we're talking about canning, it's really important that you follow a good science and a tested recipe. So I just wanted to give you some examples of some things that happened not so long ago. I have two examples. Both of these are from 2015. It just so happens that that's when both of these events happened. But this one was relatively close to where I live, in Ashe County, North Carolina. A lady that she had a jar of canned carrots and she put it in her mouth. She didn't even swallow it. She just took a bite, put it in her mouth, and then didn't think it looked right, and it maybe tasted funny or something was wrong, and so she spit it out. But that was enough to give her botulism, and she was in the hospital for 11 weeks on a ventilator. She still has some long-term issues, and a lot of people that are exposed to botulism, the botulism toxin, have lifelong issues after, if they can recover from the illness. So it is just, it's something you really don't want to mess with. And the reason why she got botulism is because her canning technique was not correct. In other words, she water bath canned those carrots instead of following a proper pressure canning recipe. Then there was another lady that made potato salad for her church potluck out of her canned potatoes. So she had home canned her potatoes using a boiling water bath canner, which was incorrect because potatoes are a low acid food. And she poured them into the bowl and, drained them, and then made her potato salad. And there was one death and over 20 people hospitalized from her church, from the people who ate that potato salad. So it's not something that you want to take a chance with. So let's talk about some important musts for safe canning. Food must be properly prepared and processed for the correct amount of time. In other words, there's that use a tested recipe statement again. You also want to make sure that you know how to use your canner. You want to make sure that you're using it properly according to the manufacturer's directions and that it's accurate. So, have it, in some cases, depending on what kind of canner you have, it might need to be tested on an annual basis. Depending on your altitude can have an influence on canning. So you may need to make altitude adjustments. You want to look at your recipe and determine, what your altitude is, and then what the pressure and the time should be for your altitude. Again, recipes, directions for canning should come from a reputable source. So USDA, any cooperative extension, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and the more recent editions of the Vol Blue books. And then there's also a book put out by the University of Georgia called So Easy to Preserve, is a good source as well. You really want to make sure you're not going back to these old recipe books or just what you found on Pinterest or the internet, because you just don't know for sure if it's using an up-to-date method. I usually tell people, be sure you're looking, at the source of the recipe and that it is truly coming from, a tested scientific source. I threw this in here, this slide in here, or the next two slides, because I know last week on the water bath canning presentation, one of the questions at the end was like, well, why do we have to have a certain size jar? Or, why is it a certain amount of time as far as the recipe is concerned? Well, I kind of wanted you guys to see, well, how do we determine, what the canning time is depending on what size jar and what the food is? Well, it's true science. They have actually tested and studied the length of time it takes to adequately heat the coldest spot in the jar once it's packed. So basically, the size of the jar, the size of the food, and the liquid that you're using in the jar all have an effect on how the heat penetrates through the product. And so the size of the jar can really make a big difference, and then even the size of the food. So what that means is follow the directions. Don't add any extra sugar or fat, because that can change the way the heat penetrates. Make sure if it says cut the pieces into 1-inch cubes, that you're being pretty consistent and trying to keep it into that 1-inch cube. because if the food is too large or larger than what the recipe calls for, it can affect how that heat penetrates the jar. And especially don't add any kind of thickeners or extra ingredients to the recipe, because that can again change how the jar can heat up. I also like to point out that the recipes the heat up and the cool down times for the pressure canners is counted toward the heat penetration. So you don't want to hurry the process and try to quick cool your canner at the end. You know, this process it's something you plan for, and it's not necessarily quick. You can produce some really great, safe, home preserved food, but you want to make sure that you have plenty of time to get it done and you're not trying to rush it. So let's talk about methods of packing your food in the jar, because some recipes will call for a raw pack, and some recipes might say hot pack. So I want you to know the difference between the two. If it's raw pack, that means you're taking fresh food that has not been cooked and just putting it straight into the jars. And then you take hot liquid and pour over the food, you know, once you've got your jar filled. Whereas hot pack has to do with where you've actually cooked the food in a liquid before you pack it. So, or maybe you've just cooked it, depending on what kind of product it is. But the food is hot or warm when you put it in the jar. A lot of recipes and even people will say they prefer the hot pack method, only because it usually with the hot pack food, the cooked food, you can get more food in the jar and it's easier to pack. So you're less likely to have a lot of extra liquid in the jar or floating pieces in the jar. And you can use less jars to can your food. And a lot of times, depending on the product, you might have better color and flavor. The key here is follow your directions. Some recipes will have directions for both raw pack and hot pack, whereas other recipes might just say only hot pack. So make sure you're following the right, directions for what you're trying to do. Headspace in canning is very important. I think Dawn Barnes might have mentioned this last week, but I wanted to reemphasize that headspace is very important to know, read your recipe to decide what headspace you're going to use. When you're pressure canning, your headspace is usually going to be 1 inch to 1.25 inches. Whereas if it calls for a headspace at 1/4 or 1/2 inch, those are usually for our acidic food items that we're going to water bath can. So, but headspace is the space between the top of the food or the liquid that's in the jar and then the top of the jar or the inside of the lid. So this diagram kind of helps you see, what they mean by headspace. And there's actually headspace measuring tools that you can actually buy to help you make sure you've got that right amount of headspace. So headspace, why would people like, why do I need to be real specific about having the right amount of headspace in the jar? Well, if you don't have the right amount of headspace, you have to imagine that as the jar is heating, that food is going to expand. So you need a place for that food to be able to expand. If you have too little headspace, your food may actually bubble out during processing, and then those food deposits can actually sit on the rim and cause the jar not to seal. If you have too much headspace, your food that's it ends up being out of the liquid can discolor, and then again the jar might not seal properly because you weren't actually able to get all the air out and form the proper vacuum. When you're looking at your jars and lids, when you're preparing for your canning, you want to make sure that your canning jars are clean. So you definitely want to, clean them before you use them. Check them out. Make sure that they're not nicked or cracked. You don't see any, little hairline scratches or cracks in them, because You don't want to use those because once those jars get under pressure, all you can cause to break during the process, or jars not to seal if there's a nick on the rim of it. Also, you want to make sure, especially if you're, when you're going to put hot food or hot liquid into a jar, you want that jar to already be warm. So it's good to keep them warm until you're ready to fill them. You also want to you want to have your two-piece canning lid system. So you're going to have a canning lid, and then you're going to have a ring or band that screws down the lid on top of the jar. So you'll read the instructions. A lot of people, it used to be that the instructions said that you had to heat your lids. That is not true anymore, but I still say follow your instructions on the lids. But the two-piece canning lids that we can get today, unless your stores are out of them, as they all are right now because we can't find any, but the lids that you purchase today, you can actually just make sure they're clean. You don't actually have to heat them. I did want to say right here, and I didn't put this in the presentation, is that you guys need to make sure that you only use your lids once. Your lid is only meant to actually be used one time. And if you try to use it more than once, it's going to end up probably not sealing. That rubber, the seal on that lid is not only made for one-time use. Now your rings or your bands, you can actually wash them and use them, multiple times. Once you've got your food in your jar, you want to try to remove the air bubbles. So you can actually just stick a knife or a little spatula. You can actually see right over here on the left-hand side, they've stuck a little spatula down in the jar. But you just want to stick something down in there and remove the air bubbles. You want to make sure you wipe off the rim of the jar with a wet, maybe a clean cloth or paper towel, just to remove any food debris that could be on the top to keep it from sealing. And then you put your lid on the jar and then fingertip tighten the ring. You don't want to really screw it down tight because that can, if you do it too tight, it actually can keep the air from being able to escape out of the jar, and it'll cause your lid to buckle and then not seal. Or if you put it on too loose, it can actually cause the lid to not seal because it's just not sitting down tight on the jar rim. So as far as processing time, that will be in your recipe. And every recipe, each type of food has its own processing time. So just because your potatoes said one amount of processing time, your green beans are probably going to say something different. Meat is even going to be different. So you really want to make sure you're following the recipe for the amount of process time that you need. A lot of recipes will give you processing times and pressures for different types of jars or sizes of jars, maybe for pints and quarts. So you want to make sure that you're using the right size jar and following that processing time for the size of jar that you're using. So what happens if you don't process long enough? Well, if you don't process long enough, you could end up with food spoilage, but even more importantly, you could end up with unsafe food that could really hurt somebody. So to just kind of talk about what do we need to do to get ready to can? The very first thing is find your recipe that you want to use, read through the whole thing so you can really get an idea of how much food you're going to need, what you're going to need to gather. So once you've gathered all of your ingredients and supplies that you might need, go ahead and have that out and have them all ready and handy. You also want to grab your canner and go ahead and fill it with 2 to 3 inches of water and put it on the stove and turn it on kind of, a low temperature to get that water hot. So it's kind of simmering in the canner. And of course, go ahead and have all of your jars and lids washed and ready to go. Then you want to once you've got your jars, you're packed, so you followed your recipe, you've got your jars, your food packed in your jars, your lids on, you're going to actually place that jar into the canner. And if you'll notice here in our canner, you see this rack down here on the bottom. All canners need to have a rack. You don't want your jar sitting directly on the bottom of the canner. So make sure your rack is always put back in your canner. So you place your jars into the canner, and then usually, as you can see here, I was doing 7 quarts. So you can actually get 7 quarts in your average canner. Once you've got your jars in your canner, you're going to put your lid on your canner. So you're going to, line it up, and usually there's little arrows you can see. Put your lid on the canner, lock it down, make sure it's in place. And when you do that though, you want to make sure that the vent here, this little piece that sticks up, is uncovered. And this picture or this diagram here shows you 2 different types of canner lids. There's this one up here is a canner lid with a dial gauge on it. And then this one is showing you a canner lid with a weighted gauge. But both of these have the little vent port here. And when you put the lid on, you need to make sure that it is uncovered and open. The other thing I kind of wanted to point out here, as far as canners go, a lot of people are afraid of pressure canners. They've heard horror stories about the lids blowing off. Well, today's pressure canners are very safe to use as long as we're operating them according to directions, because they actually have some built-in safety features. You'll notice this little cover lock right here that both of these have. Once the pressure builds up and that thing pops up, it keeps you from being able to open the canner, while it's under pressure. So you can't open it and the lid won't blow off. The other thing is that if the pressure gets too high, there's actually a safety fuse, a little rubber safety fuse here built into the lid of the canner that, if for some reason something malfunctioned and the pressure got too high, that safety fuse would pop out and keep it from the lid from coming off of the canner. So the next thing we need to do now, so we've got our canner full of food, we've got our lid on, and the vent is open. The next thing we need to do is what we call exhausting or venting the canner. And like I mentioned, pressure canning is not something that you can do quickly. It does take quite a bit of time. So the next thing is going to take us about 10 minutes. You have to actually, once you've got your canner on the stove, you're going to turn it on high, and you're going to wait until you see a steady stream of steam coming out of that vent port that we left open. And once you get that steady stream coming out, you're actually going to set a timer for 10 minutes. So you don't set the timer until you see the steady stream coming out. That's called venting the canner. Basically what we're trying to do is get all of the air out of the canner, because we need to can in a pure steam environment. So we're trying to get all the air out of the canner. So that's what the venting or exhausting of the canner does. Once we've done that for 10 minutes, then we're going to actually close that vent port. So we're either going to put the weight, if it's a weighted gauge canner, or the counterweight, if it's a dial gauge canner, on that vent port to keep the steam from escaping anymore. Then you're going to wait, and it's going to take a little bit of time for the canner to come up to pressure. And you're only going to start your timer for your processing time once the correct pressure is reached. So you kind of have to, it's going to take a little bit of time to come up to pressure. So, if it says, you need to, process for 25 minutes at 15 pounds of pressure, you're going to have to watch either your gauge or your jiggler, if it's a weighted gauge canner. And when it finally starts functioning, like it gets up to the right pressure, then you will start your processing time. And you can control pressure in the canner by either raising or lowering the heat on your stove. So if you realize that your gauge is getting too high or your pressure seems to be getting too high, you can actually lower the heat of the stove, and then that way you can lower the pressure in the canner. So I wanted to show you this diagram because it kind of helps reemphasize everything we just talked about. It gives you a visual. This is where we put the jars into the canner in the 2 to 3 inches of hot water down in the bottom of the canner on the rack. Then the second picture shows you where we've turned it on high heat and we're waiting until we see steam coming out like in a funnel type shape out of the vent port. So that's what we mean by venting or exhausting the canner. And we're going to do that for we're going to let that happen for 10 minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes, then we put the weight over that vent port. And then once this little, the little valve pops up, the lock pops up, and then if it's a weighted gauge, it'll start jiggling. If it's a dial gauge, it'll start raising up. And once it gets to pressure, that's when we start our processing time. So this is actually a picture of my canner on the stove. And so I just this is a dial gauge canner, but I was actually supposed to be processing at 12 pounds of pressure, and you'll notice I'm just a little bit above that. So in order to help not over process my food, I knocked the heat down just a little bit to try to keep it from continuing to get too hot. So, and then you see here, I've got the weight over the vent port, and then the safety lock is popped up and is in place. So once the processing time has finished, so we've done it for the proper amount of time, we can turn the stove off, and so that, and take it off the heat. Now, for a dial gauge canner, you're going to wait until you're going to watch the gauge and wait until that pressure drops to 0. Once it hits 0, you still need to wait another 1 to 2 minutes to ensure that the pressure is down. Then you can open the vent. Once you've removed the weight and opened the vent, you still want to wait 10 more minutes on top of that to ensure that some of the heat and the pressure has escaped. For a weighted gauge canner, you have to actually, because we can't actually see anything, we don't have any gauge to read, we actually have to use time to know when to remove the lid. So we time the process. For our newer canners that we've got, we're going to wait 20 minutes for pints, 30 minutes for quarts. For the older, thick canners, you're going to wait 30 minutes for pints and 45 minutes for quarts. I usually say, refer to your instructions. You're going to take the weight off, and then again, wait 10 more minutes before you remove the lid. When you take the lid off of your canner, it is going to be very hot inside that canner. So you want to open that lid away from you so that the steam doesn't rush up and burn you. Once you've got the lid off, you're going to take the jars out of the canner. It's really best to use a jar lifter, a little handy tool, so that you don't burn yourself, because they're going to be very, very hot. Put them on some kind of rack or towel, or maybe if you've got a large cutting board or something like that. And then you're going to listen for the pop. And I hope this works. I'm going to see if I can get this to play so you can hear it. Did you hear that sound? Oh, good. That's what you're listening for. Once it's out, once you know that the jar has sealed, you'll hear that pop, and that is such a rewarding sound. We're gonna, once we've seen that the pop has happened, the jar looks like the jars have sealed, we're gonna let them cool undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. You really just wanna set them there. Don't be tempted to move them. Just leave them sitting there for at least 12 hours. Then you wanna recheck them and make sure that they have sealed. So I wanted to show you this last little slide here, just so that you could see, or next to the last slide anyway, that you're going to look at your lids, and you can see this one, it has like it's curved inward in the center, and it doesn't move if you press on it. Whereas if you look at this one has a raised center. and that means it didn't seal. The other way to test them is if you tap a metal spoon on the lid, you should hear a clear little ding instead of like a dull thud. The clear ringing sound means that lid has sealed. Now, to store your food, you can actually remove the rings. Some people think, oh, they need to leave the rings on. You do not have to leave the rings on. You can take them off. Once we know that that food is cooled and sealed properly, we can remove the rings and reuse those for another, canning process. But you do want to store your home canned food in a cool, dry place. Like I use my basement because I happen to have one, because basements tend to stay the same temperature. You want to avoid putting it in places where the temperature fluctuates. So, if you have a cool room in your house, or just somewhere where you know that it can stay and there won't be a large fluctuation in temperatures, is the best. And that canned food is, for quality wise, they suggest using it 12 to 18 months. So try to use up your oldest stuff first so that you're getting it for the best quality. But that food is really safe to eat as long as the seal, as long as it's sealed and it was properly canned, even past that 18 months. But they say 12 to 18 months for best quality. That sums up what I wanted to make sure I covered, and I'm sure I did not hit everything. So I welcome your questions for Chrissy and I. So should I stop sharing my screen, Devin?
Yeah, you could stop sharing it.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I will admit that I'm terrified to try pressure canning. But this has made me feel a little better. So maybe now I'll give it a shot. So our first question, this is a really good question and a really important one. What's the difference between a pressure cooker and a pressure canner?
So a true pressure canner is going to hold at least 4 quart jars. So, and a lot of times we have a pressure cooker. I mean, they still sell stovetop pressure cookers, and I can remember my grandmother using them all the time. And then also there's an electric pressure cooker today. A lot of people call them the Instant Pots, but that's just a brand name. But anyway, electric pressure cookers. But a pressure cooker is truly just a cooker where you're cooking maybe a food product or a meal, and then you're gonna eat it and consume it. You're not truly using it to preserve food long term. Whereas a pressure canner is being used to preserve the food.
And should you or could you use a pressure cooker if you didn't have a pressure canner?
You could use it as long as officially the reason why they want to make some devices are called a pressure cooker and canner. So you can use them for 2 things, for both, either way. But you want to make sure if you're truly going to be using it for pressure canning that it holds at least 4 quart jars in order to ensure that it gets the right amount of heat to the coldest spot of that jar and your food is safe.
Okay. And for people who, like me, maybe have never tried pressure canning before or are a little intimidated by the process, is there a local resource that they could reach out to if they have more questions, or even want to have like maybe a mentor or somebody that they could ask questions
Oh
of?
gosh, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to put in a plug for, due to this COVID-19 situation, so many of the extension agents here in Virginia have worked very hard over the last couple of months, and along with the food science department, have put together an online curriculum for all types of food preservation. And that is can be found on the Virginia Cooperative Extension website. So that's a great resource because you can learn not only about pressure canning, but all types of food preservation. But also, I mean, if you get kind of stuck and you're afraid or not sure of something and you're in the middle of the process, you can always call your local extension office. You're welcome to call me. I answer questions a lot of times from people all across the state, even though you don't live in Wythe County. But a lot of counties do have a family and consumer science agent in the county that would be glad to help you walk you through proper canning procedures or help you figure out if you've done it right or wrong or whatever the situation might be. And what I'll tell you too is that your extension office is a great resource for in-person hands-on canning classes once we get to where we can actually do those again.
Yeah, and I can put the link to the home food preservation course and also your local extension office list. I'll put those in the description of this video so it's easy to find. Another question here, is it safe to can meat?
Well, I'm going to let Chrissy answer that one because she does a lot. She can tell you all types of meat that she has canned. So yes, tell them about the different types of meat you can.
We can anything from rabbit to squirrel to deer to pork to bear to fish to chicken. Have I missed anything? But absolutely, it is completely safe to can meat, and it saves you a lot of freezer room.
And it not only does it save you freezer room, I think too, when you think about, you can, and I'll tell you, canned meat is not necessarily the most attractive looking thing on the shelf, but right. When you open a jar of canned meat, you can have a meal in minutes because it's already done and it's so tender. I mean, and it's really, canned meat's really good for the tough cuts of meat too.
Yes.
So it makes them into really tender product.
Super quick tacos.
That's a great idea. Another question here, how long is it safe to store canned goods? And I think you mentioned 12 to 18 months is the recommended time. Are there any particular things that people should be extra careful about, different canned products, storing them?
Just the thing the thing for safety is just to make sure you check that product when you open it to make sure it doesn't smell bad or nothing, that the seal was still good on the product. As long as it seems properly sealed and it doesn't have an off smell, then there's a good chance, and you're sure that you processed it correctly, then it's safe to consume even after that 12 to 18 months. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I think I've got some peaches that I canned 2 years ago when I just opened them and they were great. They were still good.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. One is, so what should you do if you have a recipe that you want to use and maybe it suggests using a pint jar, but you want to do a half pint?
Well, so you can always, like a lot of times, if you want to do smaller jars, but the recipe only has pint or quart, say, instructions for it, you just would, even though you're using a smaller jar, you're going to process using the pint, the next size jar up. So if you're trying to only want to use half pints, then you still have to process it for the same amount of time as the pints. And then there's even, where I hear that the most is that they're started selling these pint and a half jars, and which can be really handy for some. They're the wider mouth jars and they're easier to pack for some products, but there's no recipe for a pint and a half. So what you have to do is follow the directions for the next size up, which is a quart.
That's a really good tip. I have some of those pint and a half jars. Didn't know that. So that's a really good tip. Okay, our last question here. So question about if you're canning something and then when you get it out, it seems to have more headspace than when you put it in.
So that happens. Sometimes what happens is that, if you didn't put your ring on quite enough, then some of the liquid can boil out. Also, if the heat's too high, it can cause some of the liquid to lose some liquid from the jar. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It didn't go bad. It's just that you just lost a little bit of the liquid in the jar. Some of the food that's outside of the liquid may discolor, but it doesn't mean that it's gone bad. It's still safe to eat as long as it's sealed properly.
Okay, thank you so much. That was perfect. Hopefully that answered some of our questions. I think we got all of them this week about pressure canning. If you do have any questions about home food preservation or gardening, you can always reach out to your local extension office, and I will put the contact information for finding your local office in the description of this video. Next week, we're going to be back here on Thursday again at 2 for freezing. So another great option for home food preservation, and one that doesn't really require you to have any extra equipment. All you need is a freezer. And pot, I guess, to boil stuff too. So join us next Thursday back here. And thank you so much again to Sandy and Chrissy. That was great. And hopefully this will be helpful to some people.
We hope so. Thank you for having us.